Hi guys, welcome to the last video in this cardiac action potential lesson. We're going to talk a little bit about modulatory channels, things that modulate the action potentials in both the SA node and the ventricle. Then we'll do a quick summary of the ventricular action potential where I show you all the currents and how they act together. And then we'll talk a little bit about smooth muscle and we'll wrap this up, okay? So here we have a number of modulatory channels in the SA node and in the ventricle. Here's our SA nodal action potential, here's our ventricular action potential, that you should probably be aware of. At least three that we're going to go over right now, okay? The first one is relatively important. This is our acetylcholine-gated potassium channel. This is in your SA node and AV nodal cells, okay? So this channel opens when acetylcholine binds to the muscarinic receptor, and it's actually opened by this G protein, this GI protein, and it allows potassium to flow out of the cell, so it increases outward current. So if acetylcholine is being released from parasympathetic nerve endings, you know you probably want to slow your heart rate, right? Well, an increase in outward current will do that. Here's our phase 4, and as you guys know, our phase 4 is setting our heart rate. The more rapid phase 4 depolarizes, the quicker you'll hit threshold, and the more rapidly you'll fire action potentials, and you'll get an increase in heart rate. The slower the depolarization, the longer it takes to hit threshold, and the slower your heart rate. Well, if you increase the outward current, you have positive charge leaving the cell. You're shoving this membrane voltage down. And what you're doing is you're causing this rise to be more slow, okay? So your phase 4 rises more slowly when this channel is open. It takes you longer to hit threshold, and your heart rate slows. And that's how this works. This modulatory channels slows your heart rate in your SA node, okay? You have IK-ATP. This is, believe it or not, the most abundant potassium channel in the ventricle, and it is ordinarily closed. And it opens when ATP drops to a really low level. So you might find out that these channels open when ATP drops precipitously, let's say in an infarcted area or something like that. And it has good and bad effects. The initial effect is probably good, in that what happens is you get this massive outward current of potassium, and it holds your membrane voltage down, and it keeps your cells from depolarizing. It conserves ATP that way. So you have a rapidly depleting supply of ATP. You conserve ATP by preventing the cell from depolarizing and using a bunch of ATP, okay? Unfortunately, over time, because you have this massive outflow of potassium, you develop a local hyperkalemia, and that hyperkalemia causes your resting membrane voltage to rise. You get resting and activation of sodium channels, and that will be pretty bad for both the damaged tissue and any tissue around it. So there are good and bad things about this. Initially, probably good and protective. Later on, probably not so good. But then again, by that point, maybe your heart is worried about other things like arrhythmias and stuff, okay? All right, so that's your IK-ATP channel. You also have a chloride channel that is gated by cyclic AMP. So when your sympathetic nerve endings release norepinephrine and you activate GS and you increase cyclic AMP, this cyclic AMP does two things. It opens your pacemaker channel here, and that causes this phase 4 to rise in the SA node, okay? So that your heart rate increases because the cyclic AMP goes up. You're opening your pacemaker channel more rapidly, and you increase the rate of rise here, and you hit threshold sooner, okay? And that ups your heart rate. The other thing is, particularly in ventricle, this rise in cyclic AMP will bind these chloride channels and cause them to open. So what does that do? Well, your equilibrium potential for chloride is about -55. So what that does is it causes, in your ventricular myocyte, when you open up more chloride channels, the chloride actually is will actually conduct an inward current, that is chloride leaving the cell, and that tends to pull your voltage up toward this equilibrium potential. So more open chloride channels tends to pull your voltage up, and so your threshold potential becomes less negative, and it's a little bit easier to fire an action potential. And then what that also does, and this is probably the more important of the two effects, is once your phase zero crosses this equilibrium potential, the current goes from outward to inward, or from inward to outward, where instead of pulling your voltage up, it's actually pulling your voltage down once your voltage gets beyond this point. So your chloride channel actually switches, and it goes from primarily an inward current to primarily an outward current, and it goes from pulling your voltage up to pulling your voltage down when you cross that line. Well, if you're pulling your voltage down during this plateau phase, remember I talked about the fact that it's really easy to disrupt the balance of currents in that plateau phase because the currents are relatively small. If you up the chloride current, you'll pull down more strongly during this plateau phase, and you'll shorten the action potential. And that's something you actually want to do when you increase your heart rate, because when your heart rate goes up, that means, you want this action potential to be over, and you want to get that membrane ready to fire again relatively quickly. So what you do is you shorten your action potential up, get back down to rest, and get ready to fire. And it also allows you to relax your cardiac muscle a little bit more rapidly because you're cutting off calcium influx and calcium release in the cardiac cell. And so you get more rapid relaxation, which is something you also need when your heart rate goes up. So this chloride channel will help shorten this plateau phase. That means shorten your action potential altogether, and that's something you want at higher heart rates, which are also going on during this beta-adrenergic stimulation. So of the two effects, that's the more important one. The one where you're pulling up from rest, that might be important in terms of generating arrhythmias and stuff like that. I wouldn't worry excessively about that, but it could cause your diseased muscle to want to fire more easily because it raises the threshold potential. But don't worry about that nearly as much as the fact that you're getting help shortening this action potential because this chloride current is pulling you down toward minus 55, and it's disrupting that balance of currents during the plateau, and it's shortening it, okay? And it's allowing you at increased heart rates to get back down to rest quicker, okay? All right. So here is a quick summary. This is a really handy summary of all the currents that are taking place during the ventricular myocyte. Notice the first current to open during phase 0 is the sodium current. This current, as it's represented here, is 1/50th of the scale of all the rest of these currents. So if it were to scale with all the rest of these, that current would go down through the floor below this whiteboard. Because it's just this massive sodium current, and it opens the channels open really quickly, they activate quickly, they inactivate really quickly during this phase 1, okay? All right. Notice that our calcium current starts to flow during this phase 1 and stays flowing all the way during the plateau phase. And then you get deactivation, closure of the open activation gates at this point, and you get continued inactivation as long as the voltage is relatively high, and that shuts down this calcium current until it's shut down completely during phase 3, okay? The sodium calcium exchanger activates during this plateau phase. This outward current that you see, the sodium calcium exchanger is actually reversible, just like the chloride current. And some people will tell you that you initially get an outward current during this action potential. That is, the sodium, instead of flowing in, will actually flow out, and you'll get calcium that will come in. I am not at all convinced that that happens to any significant extent in a cardiac cell, and I will tell you it happens to nowhere near this extent in a cardiac cell. In that respect, this figure is kind of erroneous, okay? So ignore this as far as you and I are concerned. This is entirely an inward current where sodium is coming in and calcium is going out in exchange for it. And so it's an inward current during this plateau phase. So these are your two inward currents during the plateau phase. And then You have an outward current during phase 1. This is your transient outward current. Remember, it activates during phase 1 and then gradually inactivates, just like a sodium channel will, only much more slowly. In both, it opens more slowly and inactivates more slowly, but it's pretty much terminated by the time you get a good part of the way into phase 2. But these two inward currents that are flowing mostly during phase 2 are balanced by your delayed rectifier currents, IKS, IKR, and IKUR. IKUR activates really quickly, and then IKR is activating during this phase, and then it plateaus full off, and then you see this rise that you get late. That's IKS opening, and as all these channels, particularly the IKR and the IKS, added together, as that builds, you can see how this outward current can get bigger than this inward current, the sum of these inward currents, and the outward current takes over, and you get repolarization of the membrane, and you get phase 3. As this overpowers these two, okay? And then notice how your inward rectifier during phase 4 initially kind of high. You know, if you remember your IV curve, you're getting a fair outward current at rest. And now look what happens. That current shuts down. The open channels stop conducting potassium as this voltage goes up. And so it's a relatively low current during the plateau phase and during phase 1. But look what happens as your voltage gets back down into the area where this channel starts to conduct outward current again. All of a sudden you get more outward current, and you actually get a little peak here until it declines and comes back to where it started during phase 4. And that's the effect of this repolarization, coming back down into membrane voltages where your inward rectifier becomes more active and you're conducting more outward potassium, and you conduct a lot of outward potassium current toward the end of phase 3, and it remains relatively high during phase 4. Okay, and then notice our chloride current starts inward because the equilibrium potential is minus 55. When you're at a resting potential of about minus 90 or so, your chloride is flowing in such a way that you're pulling the voltage up. That is, you have negative charge, chloride leaving the cell, and it's pulling you up toward minus 55. So you have an inward current here, black. And then notice during phase 0, we cross that minus 55 line, and now our current switches from inward to outward, where now all of a sudden chloride is coming into the cell, and you're trying to pull down toward minus 55, and you're pulling down toward minus 55 during this plateau phase. And then during phase 3, we cross that minus 55 voltage again, and we go from outward to inward. And we end up at an inward current during phase 4, okay? So this is a nice summary of all the currents that go into the ventricular action potential. There is a similar one at the end of the lesson notes for the SA node, and so that can also be handy to go through. It kind of helps you to put all these together and see what's happening as the voltage changes and as these different currents flow. And I do expect you to understand in a general way how each of these flows during the action potential. So this can be a particularly handy chart for study. Okay? So let's end this video by talking a little bit about smooth muscle. I know you've had a lesson on smooth muscle from me already. Just as a general review, like cardiac muscle, these can be modulated by external influences. So your autonomic nervous system can make cardiac muscle contract with more force, a positive inotropic effect, more contractility, and of course you can have less inotropic state as well. You can have a decline, let's say in atrial muscle with a release of acetylcholine and an increase in parasympathetic tone. Similar to that, smooth muscle, again, modulated by external influences, including the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Many do not require nervous input to generate an action potential. So unlike skeletal muscle, which isn't really modulated by external influences all that much and does require nervous input to generate an action potential, smooth muscle does not. And of course, the autonomic nervous system, very important in regulating the activity of smooth muscle. And the synapses between the autonomic nervous system nerves and the smooth muscle are called varicosities. And the reason they're given a special name because they're really wide. A normal synapse between a nerve and a skeletal muscle, which will cause the skeletal muscle to contract, is fairly narrow. It's in the tens of nanometers, like 15 nanometers or something. Varicosities are like a micron in width, between a micron in distance between, a micron in distance between the synaptic membrane, the nerve, and the postsynaptic membrane, the muscle. So they're considerably wider, okay? 1 micromolar, 1 times 10 to the minus 6th, 1 nanomolar, 1 times 10 to the minus 9th. So we're talking about going from about 15 nanometers to about 1 micrometer in terms of the distance between the membranes. So you have a big, wide synapse. And what that does is it allows the norepinephrine and the acetylcholine, which are your neurotransmitters for the autonomic nervous system, to escape out. Ordinarily, your neurotransmitters don't escape out of the narrow synapses that you find in a neuromuscular junction or in a junction between two nerves. These are designed so that your neurotransmitter spreads out along the cell, and you have alpha and beta receptors distributed over the entire cell, and the norepinephrine and, or in the case of muscarinic receptors, the acetylcholine, will spread out over the entire cell and bind receptors over the entire cell. In a normal synapse, you just have receptors just in the area of the synapse, and the neurotransmitter never really gets out of the synapse all that much. These are designed to allow the neurotransmitter, the norepinephrine and the acetylcholine, to spread out over the entire surface of the membrane and bind the receptors that are distributed over the entire cell. And the response to these neurotransmitters is very slow because, diffusion takes place slowly, and it's relatively graded, and it's global because the receptors are everywhere. Okay, so we end up with a slow, if it's a smooth muscle type that actually contracts in response to these neurotransmitters, you get a slow contraction. It's graded depending a lot on how much neurotransmitter is released, and it's global, meaning they're spreading out over the entire cell. Okay, and so your autonomic nervous system responses tend to be tuned in terms of modulating smooth muscle. It's not really there to cause an instant response. It's something that's going to take seconds to minutes to happen. Okay? All right. So that's all I got. Again, this is your summary slide for the ventricular action potential. This is the summary for the SA nodal action potential. Very similar, and so worth your while to go through these and understand them. All right? Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you guys in the rooms.